In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. It's good to be home with you all this morning. Now, you've all heard the expression, you are what you eat. And that's true enough. It's also true that you are who you eat with. All of us have a social circle, family and friends, people that we tend to socialize with, people we prefer to be with. Most of us, when we sit down to dinner, don't normally like to be around people who are eager to engage in conflict or fights. In fact, at a family gathering, we'd rather those folks stay away. We don't want a side of conflict-induced indigestion along with our turkey and dressing. We prefer people who are like us. In a sense, we are the company we keep. In a story we heard just a few minutes ago, the Pharisees are annoyed with Jesus because of the company he keeps. He's sitting around, he's having dinner, he's having a meal with tax collectors and sinners. Doesn't he understand what this does to his reputation? Doesn't he understand what it means for him to hang out with people like that? Well, I think he understands perfectly. Now, before we go on, we have to talk about what it means to be a tax collector and a sinner. Now, there were two kinds of tax collectors in the ancient world around the time of Jesus. One would be collecting taxes for one of the client kings of Rome, someone like Herod. And the other would be collecting taxes for Rome itself. Sometimes these people were tax farmers. And what that meant is that the king or the emperor would say, you have this region in which you are to raise taxes. And you have to raise X amount of taxes. Anything you raise above X amount of taxes is yours to keep. Now you can say that this was a setup for abuse. And this is a reason that tax collectors were not particularly popular. As one scholar puts it, they were the despised outcasts of Jewish religious life. And Jesus had just called one of these as a disciple. Now, sinners could be ordinary sinners, people who did something that was wrong or against the Jewish law, but they could also be people that the Pharisees considered less than observant, people who didn't observe the law as they did. And perhaps they thought, with regard to Jesus, it's one thing to preach to such people. It's another thing to sit down to dinner with them. He ought to know better. Now, who we eat with, what they eat, these were enduring questions in the early church. Jews, of course, had strict rules about what you could and couldn't eat, what was forbidden and permitted to eat, and where and when you could eat with whoever you were desiring to eat with. There's a famous story in the book of Acts where Peter is up on the roof of the house, and it's getting on to lunchtime. And he ends up and he falls asleep and he has this dream and he sees this giant sheet lowered from heaven, and there are all these unclean, forbidden animals in the sheet. And a voice says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Peter is shocked. He's never done anything like that. He's a good, faithful Jewish boy. He's never had any forbidden food. And he says, "No, I can't do that." And the voice says, "What God has made clean, don't you call unclean?" Troubled, he goes downstairs and he discovers that there's a man there to see him, a representative of Cornelius, a centurion in the Roman army, one of the oppressors of Israel. And Cornelius wants him to come to him, to see him, to tell him this new message he's been hearing about. And so Peter figures out that what's going on is more than just what is for lunch. It's a matter of people and not pork. And so he goes to meet with Cornelius, and the whole family is converted. The early church had to struggle with this question of food and fellowship. Should Gentile followers of Jesus keep kosher like the Jews to make it easier to eat together? Could Jesus followers, both Jews and Gentiles, buy meat from the pagan meat market, meat that may have been offered to an idol? All of this is a question of cultural and religious boundaries. And such questions have been with us forever. Who is in? Who is out? Who is permitted to be in community with us and who is not? Early on, it was a question of ethnicity and religious practices. To cite Acts again, in chapter 15, Paul had been out on a missionary journey, and many Gentiles had been converted. And there were so many coming in, there was a desire to figure out how they were supposed to relate to the rest of the people. Were they going to have to be circumcised and told to keep the law of Moses like the rest of the Jews? And this was a significant conversation that ended up with the council saying no, that the Gentiles did not have to keep the Jewish law in the same way that the Jews did. Jews could continue to keep the law according to their ancient tradition, but this was not going to be required of the Gentiles. And this was a watershed issue and time for the church. Jesus appears here to push against the boundaries. He tells the complainers, the critics, that he's like a doctor. He's come to serve people who are sick. He hasn't come to the righteous, but sinners. And he quotes Hosea the prophet, whom we heard this morning. Go and learn what it means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The point is, if you sacrifice correctly, if you do all of the rituals correctly, if you follow everything to the T, but you neglect mercy and compassion and love, you have failed. You are what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 is a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. When your boundaries become barriers, when they become impermeable, impenetrable, they are not a resource, but a problem. Now, the setting of religious and social boundaries in and of itself is not wrong. All societies, all traditions have them. The Jewish people survived and persevered because they had the law, because they followed and kept kosher, because they didn't work on the Sabbath. All of these things gave them identity, shaped them, made them who they were. This was a good thing. But both Jesus and Paul saw that in the new thing that Messiah Jesus was doing, in this new kingdom, such boundaries could get in the way. They could make communal life difficult. Jesus was a pious Jew and by all accounts kept the Torah perfectly. But he knew that the purity codes were in danger of keeping people who really needed healing, keeping people who really needed God from experiencing the healing and power and the presence of God. For Jesus and for Paul, the gospel is not for the pious and the proper, but for the marginal, the despised, the ignorant, and even the offensive. And this is borne out in the rest of the story we heard this morning. There are three kinds of marginality that we see in this story. There is, of course, what we've been talking about, social marginalization. According to Jesus' opponents, the tax collectors and sinners, because of their behaviors, because of their sins, were to be avoided. Fellowship with them was to be refused. To them, they were an inferior class of people to be ignored by the superior class of people, that is, them. This, as we have seen, Jesus responded to with a negative in no uncertain terms. He was going to join them at the table. But Matthew's story continues with two other forms of marginalization. The first occurs when a synagogue leader comes to him and says, "My daughter has died," and Jesus immediately goes to help. And on the road, this woman who's had a bleeding problem for 12 years comes up in the crowd, sneaks up close to Jesus just to grasp the hem of his garment. Now, the fact that she had this bleeding problem for 12 years means that she was ritually marginalized, that she was a source of ritual impurity to anyone who touched her or any place that she touched. And this made relationships within community very difficult, if not impossible for her. For some, because of her condition, she would be a ritual religious outcast. The final marginalized person in the story, of course, is the dead girl, because death is the ultimate marginalization. She's cut off entirely from her community, her family, her religious tradition, her life. It should also be noted that both of these individuals were female. They suffered a double marginalization, the ritual impurity and the fact that they were female in a strongly patriarchal society. The bleeding rendered the woman ritually unclean, and the dead body was the most defiling of all things. And Jesus, of course, eats with tax collectors and sinners. He has this woman touch him, and rather than becoming ritually unclean, Jesus heals her. And of course, he touches and raises the girl to life and restores her to her family and community. Jesus overcomes the sin, the impurity, the death, the marginalization, that which kept them from being a part of the community. He restores them. What does this have to do with us? With Peter on his visit to Cornelius, God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. As far as we are concerned, no one is unclean. No one is inherently marginal. At the end of this month, the cathedral will have a pride service. It's right across the street from Loring Park where the big festival is held. It'll be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And during that service, I've stood before up front and I've watched people because the doors of the cathedral are normally open. Not good for the heating and cooling, but they have them open anyway. And I've seen people that have stepped into the narthex tentatively and perhaps sat on the edge of the back pew, ready to jump and run away if it gets too scary. I've seen some others stand in the narthex by the door. I've even seen some stand outside of the door, peering in, listening to what's going on. And all of these people have, at one time or another, been made to feel uncomfortable, unwelcome, perhaps unclean. And they are convinced, perhaps, that they're like the woman, impure, and can only come incognito to, in effect, touch the hem of Jesus' garment. But here's the thing. Either all of us are welcome, or none of us is welcome. If a church says we're welcoming but not affirming, you are not really welcome. If a church says you are welcome but keep all your troubles to yourself, we don't want to know them, you are not really welcome. If they say you are welcome, don't make us uncomfortable with how you look or what you wear or how you behave, you are not really welcome. If they say you're welcome, but we need to get your theology exactly right, and you need to agree with our politics before you're one of us, you are not really welcome. The thing is, if you dig deep enough, if you ask all of us the right kind of questions, and if we tell the truth, it's unlikely that any of us would be welcome, myself included. Because most of us, to one extent or another, are a mess. Some more than others, of course. The late spiritual writer Brennan Manning once wrote, "When I get honest, I admit I'm a bundle of paradoxes. I believe and I doubt, I hope and I get discouraged, I love and I hate. I feel bad about feeling good. I feel guilty about feeling guilty. I'm trusting and suspicious. I'm honest and I play games." Aristotle said, "I am a rational animal." I say, I am an angel with an incredible capacity for beer. Jesus welcomed all of them. Jesus welcomes all of us. All the marginal and manic, all the frustrated and failures, all the faithless and fearful. And he calls us into this messy, frustrating, imperfect community we call the church. Because here, all are welcome, all are loved, all are healed. Thanks be to God.